all members can do the good work that they are sent here to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Orders of the day.
Orders of the day. Government orders, business of supply, following consideration of an opposition motion standing in the name of Mr. Strahl regarding the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project.
The honourable member for Peace River Westlock has 3 minutes remaining in his speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was speaking on the topic of social license, given the current motion that we are debating from our honourable leader. I would like to perhaps just go over that motion once again. I'll just read it once more. That the House agree that the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project has social license to proceed, is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs, is safe and environmentally sound, is recognized and accepted by the National Energy Board, is under federal jurisdiction with respect to the approval and regulation, and should be constructed with the continued support of the federal government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of this project. Mr. Speaker, 500 of the 630 First Nations across our great nation of Canada are open to pipelines and petroleum product development. Mr. Speaker, this means that First Nation communities across the country are divided on the issues of pipeline development and energy resource development and things like this. And so therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would say that we need to be able to treat First Nations the same way that we treat all other Canadians, and to have the diverse opinions that we have about petroleum product development. And so I would say, given this particular project, the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, the vast majority of First Nations along the route are totally excited about the fact that this pipeline is going to be built, and therefore we would really appreciate if the Prime Minister would go to BC and sit down with the people in Burnaby and have a chat with them to champion this pipeline, to make the case for the social license that this pipeline has in order to be built. And so we look forward to the Prime Minister championing this. We acknowledge that he has approved the pipeline. We know that was a hurdle in and of itself. We're concerned. We continue to raise concerns about the process of which it was approved by, but we recognize that it is approved, and the very fact that repeatedly members of the government stand up and acknowledge the fact that we've approved this pipeline. They brag about the fact that they've approved the pipeline. Now the imperative is for this pipeline to be built, and so we look forward to what the government will do in the future. We know that the market conditions are similar, or perhaps a little bit downtrodden, and that is why we in Alberta are really looking forward to having this pipeline built and bringing these life-saving petroleum products to the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This motion is a request by the Conservatives to get the Government of Canada to approve the Kinder Morgan pipeline. We've already done that. This opposition motion is trying to remind us that we should be supporting the oil and gas sector and the employees in the province of Alberta. We do that. It's less surprising that the Conservatives put politics over principle, but what is surprising is they're putting politics over pipelines. My question is, how does this member think that pitting members against each other helps us achieve our common goal?
Honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to this point, the issue with this pipeline, or the issue with pipelines in general, was social license. We didn't come up with that issue. That was brought up by the government, the fact that pipelines need to have social license, and the government therefore said that this pipeline had social license, and therefore they approved it. Now it is incumbent upon the government to dispel the opposition to this pipeline and to ensure that all the actors involved understand that this pipeline has social license, and to ensure that in the interests of Canada, this pipeline gets built. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Take away block. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's a range of things I'd like to ask my colleague from Alberta, but maybe I'll focus in on this confidence, and I would suggest overconfidence that my friends have both on the Conservative and Liberal side with respect to the National Energy Board itself. The government brought an expert panel together to review what's going on with the National Energy Board, which has had its problems. Let's more than admit to the obvious. They had to shut down the Trans-Canada pipeline hearings, the Energy East, excuse me. They had to suspend the Kinder Morgan hearings, both because of conflicts of interest, where people being placed onto the National Energy Board to review the pipeline previously worked for the pipeline companies themselves. That's called a captured regulator, where the regulator just becomes too close and too forgiving and approving of those it seeks to regulate. It doesn't work. In that expert panel's report, it said the National Energy Board faces a crisis of confidence. It went on later to say that for a generation to come, Canadians have lost faith in the National Energy Board. When Conservatives and Liberals agree on their terminology of social license, that somehow the public is on board, one would have to question how they define it. There are 17 lawsuits out against this decision. The mayors affected in the regions most impacted by this pipeline are unanimous in their opposition. That the First Nations he talks about, I deal with many of them. Do not misrepresent when someone signs an agreement to discuss as an agreement to the project itself, because that's what has been misconstrued continuously. So my question is this, and it's very simple. You cannot rely on the NEB process. The Prime Minister, current one, promised British Columbians and Canadians that he would review the pipeline under a valid process, because he himself admitted that the one that had been put in place by Mr. Harper was inefficient and ineffective and did not build the public confidence you need to have social license. So the process is the same one that Harper had. This Prime Minister used it as well. My question is this. Under all that review, there was no evidence put forward that you could actually clean up a diluted bitumen spill. Does my friend have any evidence to offer the people of Alberta, British Columbia, or anywhere in Canada that when a spill of diluted bitumen happens in salt or fresh water, you can actually clean it up? My Conservative colleagues want me to hurry because they actually know the answer. It's no.
The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the point, I have in my limited lifespan traveled to other parts of the world, and everybody that I meet from other parts of the world congratulate Canada on being one of the most clean countries in the world. And that's to our great honor. And the NEB process that has been in place has championed our ability to have world-class regulatory framework. In fact, most jurisdictions around the world look to Alberta specifically on how to manage their oil sands development or petroleum product development. And so we have nothing to fear here, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I would ask back at the honourable member who's questioning me on this to have a conversation with the Premier of Alberta. Even she understands that you need to have that there is the social license for this pipeline, and that this pipeline needs to be built in order to get petroleum products to Tidewater. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prise du débat, l'honorable député de...
We debate the honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent speech, which was separated by a question period, but he certainly delivered the goods. And I had the pleasure of visiting his riding. It was between winter and spring, and I was very impressed as a Quebecer, Mr. Speaker, for the first time to see that oil industry and how oil is developed out there. It's something that we can't imagine when we come from Quebec in a small rural village. To travel across these vast expanses because it's so big, and to see practically at every corner these oil platforms that allow Canada to be the prosperous country that it is today. Today we're talking about the motion of my colleague from Chilliwack Hope that the House agrees that the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion project has social license to proceed, is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs, is safe and environmentally sound, as recognized and accepted by the National Energy Board, is under federal jurisdiction with respect to approval and regulation, and should be constructed with the continued support of the federal government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of the project. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to speak to this motion today because it is a very important debate, and I'd like to thank my colleague for this initiative, which will allow us to debate it. But, Mr. Speaker, you know that we're sitting extended hours right now in the House, and I am convinced that there are many of my colleagues who would have liked to have talked about this even more. But unfortunately, in Motion 14 that extends the hours, we will not be able to continue any opposition motion debates. I know that there's going to be another opposition motion next week, but they won't be able to debate any longer than 8 o'clock either, because when we extend these hours, it is a unique opportunity for Canadians to hear what the official opposition and the NDP have to say about files that they care about.
Mr. Speaker, since I've done this little update, now I want to tell you more about why the opposition party has decided to go ahead with this motion and why the results of the election in BC were concerning to some, especially now that there will be a coalition between the Green Party and the NDP in that province, and it's casting doubt on the ability, the real ability and willingness of the Liberal government to implement this bill. You know, when we talk about significant projects such as these ones, which are opposed for a number of reasons, and by various people such as certain citizens or environmental groups. But there are projects that, for which there are excellent reasons to push through on, projects that merit being pushed through and that we try to convince others. It's not always possible. Sometimes it's not. We've seen many examples like that in Quebec in the past. That's kind of what is happening with Kinder Morgan. What is the role of leaders when it comes time to defend and ensure that certain projects are accepted, projects that may have an impact on local communities? It is the role of the leader, the head leader, to really sell the project, Mr. Speaker. In this case, the leader on this project, on this file, is the Prime Minister who approved this project, and that's why it should be up to him to take up the baton and go talk to the people on the ground and tell them why this is something that we really have to push through on for the betterment of all of Canada, including Quebecers. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has talked a lot about Kinder Morgan here and there, but not in British Columbia. And it's in that province that the Prime Minister needs to be heard. That's where he needs to go to help others understand how important this project is. And it's the only place the Prime Minister has not gone to talk to about this project, so that his electoral base will not be unhappy with him, perhaps. I don't know. I'm not going to say that he did such and such thing for such and such a reason. However, it's unfortunate that he has yet to go to BC. Energy resources are very important to the economy, not just in the West, but to all of Canada. According to Natural Resources Canada, Canada produced 3.8 billion barrels a day, and it is a major supplier of secure, reliable crude oil to international markets, surpassed only by Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. And it has 171 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, of which 166.3 billion barrels are in the form of oil sands. That is very significant for jobs in the country. The Trans Mountain Project could create up to 15,000 jobs in Canada. Now, if we look at the energy sector, it's still according to Natural Resources Canada, the oil and gas industry directly employs 709,000 and more Canadians, and that's nearly 4% of jobs in the country. Of course, we've just gone through a more difficult period because of the low price of oil around the world. And we have very much suffered about it over the past few weeks and months. We have had the opportunity to hear from our colleagues who come from the provinces where a lot of oil and gas is produced, ask the government to support their sector to get through these difficult times. When we went to Alberta, I had the opportunity to see the number of trailers that were being unused on oil fields in Alberta, and I was told that that's not a normal situation. Usually all of those trailers should be on the ground creating jobs for Canadians. I know all kinds of people from my riding who have gone to Alberta to find work. Unfortunately, that is not what's happening right now. It takes such projects as the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain project to help Canada get through these difficult problems. Despite the advances in technology, there is still a great demand for oil products. Of course, we can continue to work on finding new sources of energy, but in the meantime, oil and gas resources are there, they exist, and I don't know any colleagues who don't use any of these products every day because these products are present everywhere in our lives. That's why we need to find commercial opportunities for these products, send them towards ports, and to export them to various countries, particularly Asia. That's why we need to work to support the industry. And another reason is the safe transportation of these projects, and that's related to what happened in Lac Mégantic. So you'll see that the rail transport of these products is very concerning to me. Of course, there were changes that were made. The types of wagons used was changed, but in the meantime, oil is still being shipped, or rather sent by rail all across the country. And pipelines are one of the most secure way of transporting these products. Pipelines are a safe, reliable, environmentally friendly way to transport oil and gas. That's what Natural Resources Canada states. And spills, leaks, and ruptures are rare, and all of these pipelines are a very reliable and safe way to ship oil, and that's why we'll be voting for this motion.
Is trying to hide himself behind the Rocky Mountain instead of facing people in BC and explain to them why Kinder Morgan pipelines is important for our economy. I'm not afraid to support this project and the motion from my colleague from Chilliwack Hope. The people of Quebec, for the people of Quebec, pipelines are safe, and I think really that pipelines are good for our economy, not only for Canada, but also for Quebec. En terminant, Monsieur le Président.
In closing, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must, as he has said over time, to continue to support the Kinder Morgan project. He said he supported in Calgary, Houston, in the States, and also in Italy. He now has to do it openly, clearly in British Columbia. He must go there and tell us how he supports it, and I invite all of us to support my colleague. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Centre. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my honourable colleague on the other side for this for his speech. I have a question. What about if the National Energy Board approves for this project? Would he still support the oil and gas projects and the fact that we could send oil from one end of the country to the other in a safe and effective manner? The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It's a very relevant question. We've just come out of a very good leadership race here on this side, and our candidate, Andrew Scheer. My apologies. It's my passion. I shouldn't be naming him in the House. The new leader of the official opposition tabled a proposal or presented a proposal to ensure that Canadians would be able to know where the oil and the gasoline in the car comes from. That way, people would be able to see that a lot of the gasoline being used now comes from outside the country. That would be a great way for Quebecers and Canadians to know what is happening and be able to contribute to supporting their country, because they would be able to select stations that sell oil from Canada.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to inform you I'm also splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Edmonton Centre. Let me begin by thanking the honourable members from Chilliwack Hope for this motion, endorsing our government's decision to approve the Trans Mountain expansion program.
My apologies. A point of order. The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Yes, Mr. Speaker. Had I really finished the 5-minute period? Because period of questions? Because I only got one question. I feel like I still have time to answer some questions and allow my fellow members to ask questions.
Okay, so a little bit of confusion up at this end in terms of the clock. Alors, en conséquence.
So we will therefore continue with 2.5 more minutes for the honourable member of Mégantic-l'Érable, period of questions and comments, and after that we'll continue with the honourable parliamentary secretary with her speech. Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments.
Lady Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my colleague on the Conservative bench, is he not aware that the Kinder Morgan pipeline is entirely an export pipeline for 100% unrefined raw bitumen, that there's no energy security benefit for Canada whatsoever, that this is not going to be fueling our vehicles, this is not going to be heating our homes, this is entirely an export of jobs and energy potential that Canada will not benefit from?
La députée de Mégantic-l'Érable.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have a hard time understanding why the country would not benefit from a pipeline that would be used for exportation purposes when there will be tens of thousands of jobs created to build this pipeline. Of course, Canada will benefit from the building of this pipeline. And it's the Prime Minister's role to go to British Columbia and explain all of this and to say clearly that we're not making up reasons. If we want to create more draw more oil to create more jobs, we need to continue to support this.
Comments. The honourable member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've heard very clearly that the Liberals are supporting this motion, but they suggest that there's politics behind it. Do they not recognize, and I'd ask my colleague maybe to talk a little bit further about it, that having the government approve National Energy Board is one approval, but does he not believe that the message that Parliament will send if it approves this motion is also a very important message? Because I think there's two processes here, and they're both very important.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. That's an excellent question, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank my colleague for this question. Yes, when we want Canadians to buy into the projects, we have to look not just at the regulatory and legislative process, it's also the message sent out by leaders. This House can send a clear message saying we do support the Kinder Morgan projects for all the jobs it will create, all the benefits it will bring to Canadians. And that's why also I am asking for the Prime Minister to do his job as a Prime Minister, to take up the torch, go to British Columbia and explain to British Columbians and Canadians why this is important. This is an important project not just for the economy in the west of the country, but for all of the country. And it's the Prime Minister's role to do this, and it's Parliament's role to adopt motions to sometimes support the Prime Minister's job. Of course, if the Prime Minister gets a unanimous motion from members of the House here to defend the Kinder Morgan project, so well, we're going to congratulate him. It's not every day that I'm going to that I'm going to help the Prime Minister do his job, but in this case, we're ready to do it. And now resuming debate. Once again, I apologize for the confusion earlier regarding the change in time. The Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
As I was saying earlier, it is great to have the opposition support on our approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Thank you. Lots of challenges today. Mr. Speaker, everyone in this chamber recognizes that the past years have been difficult ones for Canada's oil and gas sector. The sharp drop in oil prices has taken a heavy toll on the men and women and their families who depend on the industry for their livelihood. And not just in Alberta or Saskatchewan or Newfoundland and Labrador, but indeed right across the country. As the Minister has pointed out, for every job created in Alberta's oil patch, at least 2 more jobs are created across the country. Of course, the converse is also true. Every job lost in the oil patch ripples across the whole country, affecting not only the person losing their job, but their family who depend on them. All of us understand that, just as we understand that we can't move global commodity prices with a snap of our fingers, no matter how much we want to. Our government believes we can strengthen Canada's ability to access new markets and compete in the global economy, all the while protecting the environment, working with Indigenous communities, and creating well-paying jobs. And that's what the decision to approve the Trans Mountain expansion project is all about. I'm not sure why the members opposite would think this would change with an election in British Columbia. After all, it was the right decision at the time, and for all the reasons outlined in this motion, and it remains the right reason today. The fact is that the Trans Mountain expansion project does have social license to proceed, despite the comments of a vocal minority. It is critical to the Canadian economy and will create thousands of jobs. It is under federal jurisdiction. And I'm pleased to confirm, in no uncertain terms, that it does have the support of this government and of our Prime Minister. It has our support because it was made based on solid science and clear evidence. Its environmental impacts were carefully considered. Its effect on communities was exhaustively canvassed. Its economic potential meticulously measured. We understood and heard the opposing views. But at the end of the day, Canadians expect their government to decide, and to decide in the best interests of the country as a whole. And that's exactly what we did. Our approval was rooted in a balanced approach, one that ensures Canada's energy sector remains a source of well-paying, middle-class jobs, as we also tackle climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's the message of this decision: balance. Because thinking only of the environment without any regard for economic growth strangles the vitality needed to sustain both. At the same time, considering only economic growth while ignoring environmental impacts would be like fixing a leaking roof by borrowing materials from the foundation. It may provide temporary progress, but it undermines long-term stability. That same sense of balance informed our decision to propose a moratorium on tanker traffic off the British Columbia coast and to make the most significant investment ever to protect our oceans and coastlines with the $1.5 billion Ocean Protections Plan. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's mandate letter to the Minister of Natural Resources is very clear on this balanced approach. It says, and I quote, "Throughout Canada's history, our prosperity has been built on our natural resources. It is a core responsibility of the federal government to help get our natural resources to market. But that is only possible if we achieve the required public trust." End quote. That's been our approach since we took office, rebuilding trust and restoring faith, after a decade of the previous government doing everything in its power to ignore valid questions and bulldoze it through its constitutional obligations. We've done that in a number of ways, by strengthening our environmental assessments and regulatory reviews, expanding public engagement and consultations with Indigenous peoples, and ensuring local communities and Indigenous peoples are true beneficiaries of resource development. It's the only way to make sure that the right resource projects, the sustainable resource projects proceed, creating new jobs and opportunities for Canadians from coast to coast to coast and every corner of this country. It's an approach that has come to define our government, promoting cleaner economic growth by getting our environmental house in order and rallying Canadians behind us. So, if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to use my remaining time to talk about this new approach. It's the foundation upon which we have built our energy vision. Mr. Speaker, our efforts started as soon as we took office, when the Prime Minister went to Paris with our provincial and territorial colleagues, and Canada helped lead the way with the global agreement on climate change, a role we will continue to play because it's the right thing to do. While in France, we also helped to found Mission Innovation, the ambitious new global partnership aimed at driving clean energy research and development like never before. And then the Prime Minister again met with the provinces and territories to launch the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. This framework has set us up on a clear path toward ensuring Canada is a global leader in the transition to a lower carbon economy. We also continue to work on a Canadian energy strategy that, among other things, will protect Canada's energy security as we put a price on carbon pollution, redefine our relationship with Indigenous peoples, and invest in new technologies to protect our coastlines through our Oceans Protections Plan. All of these measures are critical to the long-term future of Canada's energy sector, including the oil and gas industry. How? By making the industry more competitive in a world that increasingly values more sustainable practices. This was reflected in our government's first budget, which featured significant new investments in clean energy and new technologies, including technologies that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. And it continued with Budget 2017, with billions of dollars invested to ensure that Canada leads in the clean growth economy of tomorrow. Let me just add that no one understands the need for clean technology and innovation better than Canada's oil and gas sector. There would be no oil sands if it weren't for the Canadian ingenuity that found a way to separate oil and sand. That innovative spirit continues today through the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. It's a formal partnership of 13 leading companies who have invested to date more than $1.3 billion to develop and share more than 935 distinct technologies and innovations. For our part, we've proceeded with thoughtful, inclusive, and measured steps. For example, we began overhauling Canada's environmental processes earlier this year, when we adopted an interim strategy for reviewing and assessing major resource projects already in the queue. We've now turned our attention to a more comprehensive review of Canada's environmental assessment and review processes, including the modernization of the National Energy Board. We need to ensure that Canadians have confidence in the approvals of these resource development projects. We are taking a hard look at our institutions, our processes, and our regulations to make sure they deliver the best long-term results for the environment and for the economy. And while we've been protecting our environment, we've also been working hard to enhance Canada's business climate. We are improving our competitiveness at home and creating new opportunities abroad by attracting more investments, improving access to new markets, and increasing trade. That's what's behind the decision to approve the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Creating jobs and prosperity through a stronger, cleaner, and more sustainable energy sector. One built for today and for tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Bow River.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's presentation and her well thought out information she had there. One of the things that I have firmly believed in a lot of the things that I've been involved with is the incentive to change rather than the disciplinary aspect of wanting change to happen. I've always believed in. So when we talk about a carbon tax and where that money goes, my belief is, as I've known the oil and gas industry for generations, when there is incentive there there's an incredible, as she has mentioned, the technology has changed things. If the incentive is changed rather than a tax, but an incentive, that industry is incredible at making changes as to an environment that we all want, safe and clean. So I would wonder about her response to the more incentive approach rather than a disciplinary tax approach. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. Certainly, the price on carbon pollution is something we have heard from industry across this country about the opportunities for innovation that it brings. As the member knows, all of the revenues from the price on carbon pollution will be provided to the provinces. It's revenue neutral to the federal government, and the provinces can determine how they best use that tax resource, whether it is to give other incentives to the oil and gas sector, whether it's to help with building new hospitals or roads, or whatever the case may be. That's a provincial decision. But I would say, with all my meetings with the oil and gas sector, I do agree they are an extremely innovative and determined industry, and we have seen in the last number of years some amazing innovations coming out of that sector across the country, and indeed they support the price on carbon pollution because they believe that it has gotten them where they are now. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her comments. It's interesting, you know, as I was listening to the comments, she missed and skipped over the reality that the Prime Minister during the campaign, when he was the opposition leader, promised Canadians and British Columbians most particularly that there would be a renewed environmental assessment process for all projects, including Kinder Morgan. That didn't happen. Now, what we have is the Prime Minister's handpicked expert panel, which reported back just weeks ago, found that the public confidence in the NEB is so eroded that they recommended it to be completely replaced. The panel co-chair reported that, quote, everywhere we were, there was this issue with confidence, transparency, independence, safety, and security, end quote. The Prime Minister said the process was broken. The ministerial review panel on Kinder Morgan said the process was broken, and the panel expert on the NEB said the process is broken. So how can the Liberals continue to stand behind a flawed review process? How could they approve this project? Why can't they keep their promise to Canadians, and let's make sure that we actually do it right?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for her question. Certainly, during the review of the Kinder Morgan process, we as a government, the minister announced 5 interim principles that would help guide that process and have the process be more robust than it had been before. There was a recommendation because there were projects within the queue, and we had to ensure that we were fair to all parties involved. Further to that, as you know, the minister also appointed a panel, a special panel of very well-versed, responsible people who went up and down the Kinder Morgan pipeline route and engaged in a even more robust way with communities, with Indigenous peoples, with industry, and all of that informed the decision that we provided when the Prime Minister announced in November the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Member from Northumberland, Peterborough South, for splitting time with me. I also want to thank the Honourable Member from Chilliwack Hope for this motion on the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. It is one that I am happy to support. After all, it is a ringing endorsement of our government's decision to approve a project that will bring jobs and opportunity to thousands of Canadians, certainty for investors, and protection for the environment. What I find surprising, Mr. Speaker, is that the opposition thought that by proposing this motion they could embarrass our government or split our ranks. On the contrary, it provides an opportunity to speak to the merits of the decision and the comprehensive and thoughtful process that produced it. Because unlike the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, our government has demonstrated its support for the energy sector not simply with fine words, but with firm action. In nearly 10 years in office, the previous government got exactly 0 kilometres of pipeline built to Tidewater. 0. They talked a good game. They made all the right noises. They just didn't do anything. The result? Our producers were stuck being price takers instead of price makers. They were forced to sell essentially to one customer. And when new technologies such as fracking opened up, that customer's own energy reserves, reducing the need for Canadian energy, what happened? Our energy was left holding the bag. Their assets became essentially landlocked, the markets few, and the future grim. That was the legacy of the previous government. Despite pleas to build the infrastructure necessary to reach tidewater and new global markets, our predecessors remained unable to act. Why? Because they preferred to bully opponents rather than build bridges. They preferred to issue orders rather than engage in dialogue. And through their determination to downplay climate change, to ignore the overwhelming scientific evidence of climate scientists, they earned dinosaur awards abroad and isolated even potential allies here at home. Quite simply, they lost the confidence of Canadians. Our government took a different approach. We began by seeing the provinces not as enemies to be confronted, but as allies to be consulted, and as partners to be included when we went to Paris to negotiate the agreement on climate change. Nous avons poursuivi avec engagement.
We have worked hard to cement our relationship with Indigenous people by restoring a nation-to-nation relationship. That meant we would undertake resource projects by doing our best to ensure that there be opportunities for all and benefits for all as well. We also acted to restore confidence in the regulation process by putting in place interim conditions and by modernizing the National Energy Board so it would have the resources and expertise it needs for the 21st century. We've invested in clean technology and renewable energy because it is a source of many jobs and opportunities for this century of clean energy.
We're engaging with Canadians, reaching out to Indigenous peoples, modernizing our regulatory system, and investing in clean technologies, reassured Canadians that our government understood their concerns, that we shared the view of climate change as the great imperative of our times, and that we were prepared to and focused on marrying economic growth with environmental protection. All of this made it possible to approve the Trans Mountain Expansion Project and other projects, critical to ensuring that the vastness of our energy resources would be matched by the vastness of the opportunities to sell them to the world. The Trans Mountain Expansion Project will deliver real benefits to Canadians, a $7.4 billion investment for Alberta and British Columbia, the creation of 15,000 new jobs during construction alone. Indigenous communities will benefit from jobs and business opportunities through the impact benefit agreements they have signed with Kinder Morgan. And for the first time in our history, Mr. Speaker, Indigenous peoples will remain engaged throughout monitoring the project over its lifespan. This is what inclusive development looks like. It's what real progress looks like. And it's what the future of resource development in this country looks like. Monsieur le Président, l'engagement de notre gouvernement.
Mr. Speaker, our government's commitment to the environmental integrity of this project is not limited to the 157 legally binding conditions set out by the National Energy Board. We've also taken exceptional measures to protect the most vulnerable areas with a pipeline towards the Pacific Ocean by making the biggest investment to date to protect our oceans and our waterways. The National Ocean Protection Plan, $1.5 billion. We continued with a moratorium on tanker traffic along the northern coast of British Columbia, near the Dixon and the Dixon area and the Queen Charlotte area as well. These measures are substantial and take into account the importance of environmental protection, which is dear to all of us.
Support this motion and to discuss this particular project. What's more important is to see it as a part of a wider plan, a plan for economic growth in the 21st century, a plan that builds the infrastructure to get our resources to global markets and to use the revenues to fund Canada's transition to cleaner forms of energy. A plan that understands that even as we make the transition to renewable sources of energy, we continue to drive innovation in the oil and gas sector and export Canadian breakthroughs around the world. This is a process that is already underway, as the Parliamentary Secretary has said, through Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance and a host of other initiatives. That is why Alberta is legislating limits on oil sands greenhouse gas emissions, creating the conditions for innovation and demonstrating that a forward-thinking, energy-producing jurisdiction can also be a leader in combating climate change. And it's why virtually every province, Mr. Speaker, has agreed to put a price on carbon. That is the way forward for Canada. That is our vision for the future, to use the coming decades to meet rising global demand for oil and gas while funding the next generation of energy.
That is why the projects like the expansion of Trans Mountain are so important, and our ocean protection plan is so essential.
Growth and environmental protection are not competing interests. They are vital components of a single engine of innovation. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when I was on the campaign trail, and since when I've been knocking doors in the riding, it's been very clear from the comments that I've received from residents of Edmonton Centre that they want to see us develop our oil and gas resources. They want to see us have markets that are just more than one client to the south. They want to see well-paying jobs in the energy sector from coast to coast to coast. And they want to see that we're protecting our oceans, that we're protecting salmon stocks, that we are protecting the planet for their children, their great-grandchildren, and all the generations yet to come. And they want to see us as a government make sure that we keep our promise, that we keep the promise that the Prime Minister made in the mandate letters to all of the ministers, that there is no more important relationship to this government than that with Indigenous peoples. Mr. Speaker, the example of the expansion of Trans Mountain Project is an example of collaboration. It is an example of, if you will, a new Triple E, that of the economy, the environment, and energy all fused together. Mr. Speaker, the opposition members may have thought to do some mischief with this motion, but that would only be possible if our government didn't believe in the decision we made in November. Unfortunately for them, we do. It would only be possible if we weren't prepared to stand firm. Unfortunately for them, we are. And would only be possible if this government wasn't ready to argue the merits of this project. Unfortunately for them, we are.
Before the election in British Columbia, we believed, and we still believe, that the expansion of the Trans Mountain Project is in Canada's interest. We respect those who have a different opinion. Perhaps the opposition believed that there would be some on this side in the House.
I stand united, and we stand proudly behind the approval of this vital project, the Trans Mountain Project. We are delighted that the members opposite do so too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I note the member from Edmonton Centre talks about there was mischief behind this. And to be quite frank, this is not mischief. This is a very important debate that we're having today. And my question to him is, the executive branch of government got to make a decision around the National Energy Board. Does he not believe that he, as a parliamentarian, and the will of Parliament is an important one to express on this important issue? Because this is what the opportunity is before him. Executive branch made a decision. The will of Parliament is also important. So could he perhaps reflect on that?
The honourable member for Edmonton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the time that this decision was made, as a parliamentary secretary, I was part of that extended executive branch of government, and so I fully supported the decision for Trans Mountain then, and I do now. And as a parliamentarian, I think it is very important to stand up and talk about jobs, to talk about the economy, to talk about energy, to talk about the environment, and working forward with Indigenous peoples in contribution agreements that aren't simply paper-based consultation, but that are meaningful, that are going to see long-time jobs, that are going to see shared stewardship, and a co-management approach that makes sense in the 21st century.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to discuss with the member opposite one of the promises made in the election campaign. Quote, to ensure that decisions are based on science, facts, and evidence and serve the public's interest. And the second was, we will use scientific evidence and the precautionary principle and take into account climate change when making decisions affecting fish stocks and ecosystem management. So my particular concern with this pipeline approval, being a coastal member of Parliament, is that there has been no consensus on how bitumen, which is a raw, sticky, unrefined form of oil, how it would interact in the marine environment. And on a radio show, CKNW, in January, the Transport Minister said also that this research has not been done. He said, quote, if certain products fell into the water like bitumen, there is still quite a bit of research required to find out what happens when it gets into the water and how it potentially would disperse or sink is related to a number of factors like sea state, temperature of the water, salinity. These are the things we need to do more research and proper methods to recover, end quote. So how did the government approve the pipeline without having that research done?
Member for Edmonton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe one of the first things that our government did was unmuzzle federal government scientists. And we committed to making sure that we had a robust census in this country and making sure that the long-form census went out to all Canadians. As it pertains to this particular question, this decision for Trans Mountain Pipeline was based on science, based on evidence, based on a robust environmental review and the great work of the National Energy Board. $1.5 billion put towards the Ocean Protection Plan will address concerns of members on both sides of this House. That is the kind of leadership that Canadians expect from our government, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly the kind of leadership they have received.
And comments. The honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's one comment that the member said at the very beginning, said that the previous government didn't approve any pipelines, didn't get any pipelines built. I want to correct the record, so this is not a question, but he should know, being from Edmonton, the Edmonton to Hardisty oil pipeline was approved by the NEB on April 19, 2014, and built. It's 181 kilometers of pipeline. The Bakken oil pipeline, the Enbridge Bakken Pipeline Company built this, 123 kilometers, was approved on January 19th, 2012. The Alida to Cromer oil pipeline capacity expansion, also an Enbridge line, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, was approved in 2007. It's 60 kilometers. The TMX Anchor oil pipeline loop connected to this one just now was 158 kilometers of new pipeline expanded upon, approved on June 21st by the NEB. So just here, Mr. Speaker, we have hundreds of kilometers of new pipeline that were approved and built by private companies in the previous time. So the member is obviously unaware of these important facts.
Honourable member for Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it may be impolitic to call the member opposite's understanding of geography into question, but none of those particular projects tied to Tidewater. And if you look at the Hansard, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that my comments made clear that the last government made 0 kilometers of pipeline to Tidewater. Since we've been in government, let me share with you, Mr. Speaker, what we've done to create jobs in the natural resources sector. The Arnode Apatite Mine, 910 jobs. Wood Fibre LNG, 700 jobs. Black Point Granite, 100 jobs. Pacific Northwest LNG, 4,800 jobs. Nova Gas Pipeline, 3,000 jobs. Line 3 Pipeline Replacement, 7,000 jobs. 15,440 in this project. Mr. Speaker, we're creating jobs and economic growth for Canadians.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to note that I will be sharing my time with the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. And, I think I'm going to talk a little bit sort of broad picture in terms of the current state in Canada of oil and the movement of oil. And then I'll talk more specifically about Kinder Morgan and the proposal and the motion that we have in front of us today, which, by the way, is an excellent motion brought forward by our critic for natural resources. So, as we know, it's quite interesting. On the East Coast, of course, we're importing oil from many different countries that include, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and the others. And the interesting thing is the volume of oil getting imported on the eastern coast is probably about 4,000 ships per year. And on the west coast, we have 1,487 ships that are part of the movement of oil products. So a big difference. We're importing a whole lot of oil on the east coast, and there's a whole lot less volume on the west coast. And I guess what's kind of interesting about that particular fact is on the East Coast, we have people don't seem to be very concerned about the oil tanker movement. You don't hear people saying, oh, stop the oil tankers coming in from Saudi Arabia, but you hear great resistance to the pipeline that's proposed in the East. Whereas in the West, we have a relatively good support, I think, for the actual pipeline, but we have concerns about the very, very small volume compared to the East Coast and to many other countries. So, you know, of course, oil is more than just gas or to heat your homes. There's many, many products that are important. Of course, jet fuel, we know, gasoline, diesel, but it goes into iPods, many plastics, some of the pesticides, food preservatives, and others. So oil is not just about gasoline for your car or home heating. It is about many products that we use in day-to-day life. And this is why I thought it was such an absurd quote that was made by the coalition green leader in British Columbia. And he said this, and I thought it was actually, you know, in Canada, we want to have good relationships amongst our provinces, and we are one country. We're celebrating 150 years. And so I thought this was a very difficult comment to hear from the new coalition green leader in British Columbia. And what he said was for Mrs. Notley to tell BC that somehow choosing the 20th century is the way for our future is not a good sign for her and the Alberta economy. Frankly, I think she should get with the program and embrace the 21st century as well. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, there might come a day where we will not need these products anymore, and you know, I recognize that we are moving towards better jobs with renewables, but does Mr. Weaver ever get in his car? He lives in Victoria, but he probably still has to heat his house in the winter, and I expect that he probably has an iPad in his home. So it was a very insulting comment. It's very wrong. Like it or not, oil is still part of our needs, and to be quite frank, I would rather have Canadian products being used than importing from all over the world as we do currently. So I think that's something that we really need to think about. Mr. Speaker, Kinder Morgan, it's 980 kilometers long, that's the pipeline length, and approximately 350 kilometers, so about a third of it goes through the riding that I represent of Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou. So, you know, I find it interesting to hear from the NDP, the member from Skeena-Buckley Valley, that he says the mayors are against this project, that they don't want it to happen, the ones that are most affected. Mr. Speaker, the mayor of Vancouver, the mayor of Burnaby are not the ones that are most impacted by this decision. It's the mayors in the riding that I represent. It's the regional district. And the regional district, Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, has given a support to this particular project. So for him to say that the ones most impacted when the vast majority of the pipeline is going to be through other communities is wrong. So not only does it have the support of the many mayors and the regional district directors that go through the interior British Columbia and Alberta, but the First Nations communities have signed off on it also. 51 First Nations communities have signed off with community benefit agreements. And again, I look at my community where they see there's tremendous opportunity, the First Nations, and they have signed off on the agreement. So it's interesting how the only thing you hear portrayed in terms of First Nations is the lack of support from a few bands. I think it's Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish First Nations, but you never hear about Simp or Tecumloops or many of the Whispering Pines who have said, this is a good project, we support this project, we see opportunity, and we would like to see it go through. And the other thing you'd never hear from perhaps the Lower Mainland, the mayors of the Lower Mainland, is as someone that lives in the interior British Columbia, I moved in '99 to Kamloops. That pipeline has been there since it was first in operation in 1953. You sort of had a bit of an awareness that there was this tanker farm and that there perhaps is a pipeline. But to be frank, Mr. Speaker, it was no one really paid much attention. We knew that there was a pipeline. There was no discomfort with the fact that there was a pipeline going through our community. And we knew that it had an important terminus, which actually probably kept the prices of our gasoline to a reasonable level and supplied much of the interior British Columbia. The other thing that we know is we see trains that go right along our fish-bearing rivers, our salmon-bearing rivers, and we know that although train transportation is safe, it is not as safe as the pipelines. But the other key issue there is only so much capacity on our train rail system. And what happens is if you're taking up capacity with the transportation of oil, which could be done, you could be sending all these barrels through via train with no process to sort of mitigate that. You're taking away your opportunity to transport your grain, to transport your wood, and you're really going to be detrimentally impacting the whole supply chain within Canada. So the pipeline is incredibly important in terms of a part of the supply chain. So, Mr. Speaker, we have great support for Kinder Morgan, the 980 kilometers through Alberta, through, again, the communities that I represent. And then, of course, in Burnaby and Vancouver, they are a little bit more reluctant. So I think the people of perhaps Vancouver and Burnaby, I hope that they will look at this as many things. It is for the good of the country. Calgary, Alberta, is having tremendous problems. The interior of British Columbia, the vast majority of people in British Columbia would prefer to see this oil go through by pipeline rather than train and see that there is some opportunities for it. So we are one country, and today we're having this debate, and yes, the federal government, National Energy Board, has approved this project. We have an uncertain situation in British Columbia in terms of whether the coalition government will be taking over, who have clearly stated that they are reluctant to support this particular pipeline, that they're going to do everything they can to stop it. Well, they need to listen, and I hope that Parliament will send them a very, very strong message that this is important. This is the Parliament of Canada. Not only is it the executive branch, the legislative branch, many communities, many First Nations. So I would say that the motion is absolutely accurate. It does have social license, critical to Canadian economy and the creation of jobs, safe and environmentally sound, as recognized and accepted by the National Energy Board. It is under federal jurisdiction with respect to approval and regulation, and should be constructed with the continued support of the government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of the project. So again, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, you're never going to have everyone happy about projects such as this, but in this case, it clearly is in the best interest of Canada and many, many communities within Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question to the member across the way is that we have had a government that's been very proactive and being sensitive to the needs of the project. We've had a great deal of consultation. This is, in fact, a decision based on facts that have been provided and deemed in the best interest of Canada overall, both socially, economically, to proceed with. And we appreciate the motion that's being brought forward. But it's also important for us to recognize that we do need to work with stakeholders. For example, the Premier of Alberta is obviously very anxious to move forward on this. Others across Canada. It is very much an issue that applies for all Canadians. And I'm wondering if the member could just provide her thoughts on the importance to Canada as a whole, including British Columbia and all provinces.
The Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is important. For example, with the downturn in the oil sands, there is businesses in the riding that I represent who have also downturned because they supplied product to the oil sands. You hear about workers in the Maritimes who have lost their job. So this is a critically important project. We do have an oil-based economy still where we might be transitioning, but we still need oil, and Canada needs to maximize its opportunity in this area, absolutely.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire, the Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her comments. She talked about Indigenous people's support for the project, but of course, as we know, there are mounting evidence in court cases, in court challenges with respect to the Kinder Morgan expansion. In fact, there are some 17 challenges right now in the system. So I wonder if the member can comment on that in terms of Indigenous people's support.
Well, member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, the pipeline goes from Alberta, of course, it goes through the central area of British Columbia into the area of Vancouver. 51 First Nations communities have signed support and benefit agreements. So the vast majority of First Nations who are going to be directly impacted by this pipeline and the construction of this pipeline have said we approve it. We're not going to, obviously, we never get to 100% consensus, but this is a very, very solid support level. 51 First Nations communities all signing off who see the benefit. And again, I would plead with the people from Vancouver, the people from Burnaby, to look that there is need within British Columbia, there is need within Alberta, there is opportunity throughout our country. This is in the best interest of the country, and perhaps they could rethink their reluctance to support this project and get on board.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know my colleague hails from British Columbia, so I'd like to ask her a question about this agreement that the BC Green Party and the BC NDP have reached and get her thoughts on what she believes the government will actually do. So the agreement says, immediately employ every tool available to the new government to stop the expansion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the 7-fold increase in tanker traffic on our coast, and the transportation of raw bitumen through our province. So my question to her is, based on her political knowledge and knowledge of what this government is actually capable of, which is very little, what does she expect them to actually do on the ground? We know they're going to vote a certain way. They're going to pretend that they care, like they cared about Energy East. What does she think they will actually do on the ground to ensure that Kinder Morgan is built?
Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
This project is clearly within federal jurisdiction. It is a project that has been deemed in the best interest of the country. And again, I can't speculate what's going to happen in terms of the liaison, the Green NDP, I guess we call it their manifesto, for lack of a better word, but there's still obviously a lot of process that needs to happen in British Columbia. But I think I also need to go back to, I mean, people talk about the volume of oil tanker movement and just contrast that to the East Coast and many, many countries. We're not talking enormous volume here. We're talking an increase, but certainly a very reasonable, acceptable increase. And of course, the tankers of this day and age are much better designed. They're double-hulled, so there's so many more safety mechanisms that have been put in place.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to be able to speak on a subject that is particularly important in my own constituency of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, the issues around pipeline construction. And as I begin, I want to start with some context about how pipelines are built. Some members may know this already, some unfortunately may not. It's important that we start with an understanding of the context. So first of all, pipeline projects are proposed by the private sector. And already we've seen some people make claims about previous government not building pipelines to tidewater and so forth. There needs to be an understanding that pipelines are proposed and then, if approved, built by the private sector. And it's up to the government to decide to approve or not approve pipelines for which there have been applications. So that's one important point. The second point is that after a project is proposed, there is a consultation process through the Independent National Energy Board. The National Energy Board hears from different people in the community. They hear from experts. They consider the evidence and they weigh the facts around the situation, and then they come forward to the government with a recommendation. Ultimately, it is the Cabinet's call, but in my view, it virtually always makes sense for the Cabinet to approve projects which have been approved by the NEB. The NEB are, after all, the experts, and they hear and weigh the evidence, and then they present a recommendation. And finally, it's important as we think about how pipelines are built to understand that these are clearly, squarely within federal jurisdiction. There was much discussion in the public discourse about what particular provincial leaders, what particular mayors even might think about pipelines. And of course, it's quite legitimate for these people to have opinions about where pipelines should and shouldn't go, and they're welcome to express that opinion. But we don't live in a country where you have different jurisdictions that can decide what infrastructure goes into and out of their province. These are not countries, these are provinces governed by a constitution which defines what is and is not in their jurisdiction. So it is the federal